The Middle Ages are called dark and gloomy, in my opinion, quite unfairly. After all, it was the time when mills, Gothic, printing, keyboard instruments and glasses were invented. Medieval castles in general had the most fascinating events, intrigues, tournaments, lavish feasts, and I wanted to get a glimpse of how people lived within the ring of castle walls. Many people think that a castle is a tall, beautiful structure where the king and his family live. This is not entirely true. The term castle means fortification, that is, in fact, fortress walls protecting a variety of buildings, and the building where a noble feudal lord lives is a palace. Even in the X and centuries, the castle looked more like a fortified camp. In the center of the space enclosed by a moat and a rampart with fences was the only long-term building, a donjon, which was first a wooden, then a stone round or four-cornered tower, 2 or 3 story ed. In addition to being a key defensive structure, the donjon was used as a dwelling. Each floor had 1 or 2 rooms, poorly heated and poorly lit. The rest of the buildings resembled a farm or village, where people settled as they could. All these buildings were warehouses for stock and fodder, stables with a forge, a feasting hall and kitchen, as well as residential outbuildings along the walls for the garrison were simply destroyed in case of serious danger, and all the inhabitants of the castle took refuge in the donjon, where there was a chance to withstand a long siege. Thanks to cinematography, we are sure that the interior walls of castles were gloomy and gray. In fact, noblemen often decorated the interior of their dwellings, but the bright colors have simply not survived to this day. The floor was very dirty, with food, drink, dog, and cat feces, and a lot of dirt. The servants regularly swept the floor and covered it with reeds to keep it looking clean. Spiral staircases were built not only to save space, but also for defensive purposes. On a staircase twisted clockwise, a right-handed swordsman entering the castle would have a lot of difficulty in moving. By the way, spiral staircases often had steps of different sizes for the same purpose. The siege of a castle could last for months or even years, and its defense actually required a very small number of soldiers. For example, in the 13th century, the castle of Harlech was successfully defended by 36 men for almost a year. During the War of the Scarlet and White Rose, the same fortress was held by the Lancasters for 7 years, until in 1468 the Yorkist troops forced the garrison to surrender. Before the 13th century, castles were hellishly cold. There were only tiny windows, and as a result, sunlight hardly got into the rooms and the walls could not warm up. Only with the advent of the Gothic style did the windows become larger. Fireplaces did not appear immediately either. Until the middle of the Dark Ages, the rooms were heated by open fire. A fire was built in the central hall, the smoke from which escaped through a hole in the ceiling. It was a poor way to keep warm, and there was a constant cinders in the air and soot on the walls. Lighting was also a problem. It was possible to see something only in the daytime, and not very well, because the glass was very different from modern glass and did not allow sunlight to pass through. Torches effectively illuminated the room, but they gave a lot of soot and spoiled furniture and carpets. The rooms in the castle were spacious, and it bore little resemblance to modern dwellings. Often, only large halls and a few secret passages were made in the box of the building. This imperfection of the layout was partially eliminated by the fact that the halls were zoned with carpets, attaching them to the door and window frames. If necessary, all these partitions could be removed, for example, during large receptions, festivities, or during the summer months. In the early Middle Ages, all the inhabitants of a castle slept together in one room. The nobility, the soldiers guarding the castle, and the servants. Only curtains or screens, much less wooden partitions, separated the sleepers. Later, the master and his wife had separate rooms. Their rooms were called sunrooms because they had large windows, which meant that they received more light than other rooms in the castle. There was a fireplace and a large bed with a bottom made of interwoven ropes or strips of leather. It was easily disassembled, and the master of the castle took it with him when he traveled to his other properties. Toilets were small anterooms with benches with holes in them where one had to pee. The contents of the toilet fell down gutters from a great height into a cesspool or moat. Since the moat was usually closed, the stench was unbearable, especially in summer. One way to capture the lock was to climb up the chute, crossing your fingers that the toilet would not be occupied. However, it was impossible to be alone in such a cloister for a long time. The places were not separated from each other. Partitions appeared closer to the late Middle Ages. Toilets were called closets. It was believed that the stench repelled moths and fleas from the cloaks. Hunger was a constant companion of medieval people, even the aristocracy. So for castle dwellers, feasts were times of gluttony. Some ate until they vomited. The seating of the guests at the feast corresponded to the status of each person. The most important people sat on a pedestal at the head of the table, towering above the others. Sometimes toilets were placed under their seats. Less important people sat at the exit on wooden benches at the back of the hall. If a lord was entertaining guests, he could impress them by covering the food with gold leaf or serving a pie full of live frogs. The nobility were among those who in the Middle Ages could eat meat all the time, but their diet was not the usual beef, pork, or chicken, but the meat of wild animals and birds, whatever they could get: swans, geese, partridges, ducks, peacocks, sparrows, hedgehogs, badgers. Sometimes even a solid substance from the digestive tract of sperm whales, ambergris, was served. Nowadays it is used as an odor fixative for expensive perfumes. At the same time, the food was usually bland, because salt was used not to enhance the flavor of the dish, but to preserve the food as long as possible. The diet of medieval people was much less sweet than ours. Fruits familiar to us, such as oranges, were not grown in Europe, and there was no sugar. Europeans sweetened their food with honey. The inhabitants of a medieval castle practically did not drink water because it was highly contaminated. Instead, they preferred drinks made from fermented grain. By the way, women were always responsible for making them in the castle. One of the favorite pastimes of the nobility in the Middle Ages was hunting. Falconry was especially popular. Ladies also hunted and even did it more skillfully than men, because they had to chase the beast in a special saddle, which provides for side sitting. To the seat cushion was attached a ledge, on which the rider could put her feet. Active riding in such a saddle was dangerous, but it did not violate the rules of decorum of the time. In the evening, during or after dinner, we often listened to traveling minstrels, and not only for the love of art. It was akin to watching the news every night. Tournaments were regularly held on the territory of the medieval castle. Contrary to the stereotypes formed thanks to historical novels and cinematography, these were exclusively sporting competitions or staged fights, not duels. Their original purpose was to train beginners in the martial arts. However, some competitions that simulated real fights could be fatal, because the weapons used were often real. King Philip VI Valois of France issued many regulations regarding tournaments. According to his decrees, a nobleman who did not have a military rank, as well as those who married a commoner girl, had no right to participate in the festivities, and if there was a grumpy person among the spectators, he was to be immediately expelled. Would you like to enter the castle of a medieval feudal lord? What would be the first place you'd look?